Good afternoon, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started here in just a few moments. According to your programs, you have Michael Byrne listed as your moderator for today. I am, in fact, not Michael Byrne, for those of you who are familiar with Ethisphere. He had a family emergency back in Denver. He was not able to make it. I am Douglas Allen, Managing Director of Data and Services at Ethisphere. I am extremely pleased and humbled to be amongst such an esteemed panel today on a very important and timely topic, quite frankly. And before we get into it, and introductions as well, of course, the topic is getting tactical about treatment, building an effective framework for harassment and investigations. And admittedly, Susan from the previous session took my introductory statement in that between the CEO session this morning, as well as the Me Too panel, and even Erica's comments on the harassment survey data, you had a really good sense of the zeitgeist around this particular topic. And for today's discussion, it really is a conversation of how to take a more pragmatic approach to what we discussed earlier, I think. So we'll be touching on a lot of the same themes: transparency, openness, culture, and really how these all interplay under the guise of harassment and how it impacts those various things. So with that, I'll pass it on the line for introductions. Veena, you want to start us off on a little about who you are?
Sure. Good afternoon. I'm Veena Lakundi. I'm the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer for 3M Company. For those who may not know us, we are about a $33 billion company with 93,000 people around the world, and we operate in over 150 countries. And we have a series of businesses ranging from healthcare, consumer, and then 3 industrial-facing businesses. So I'll kind of start there and
Thank you.
on.
Hi, everybody. My name is Antonio Fernandez. I'm the Chief Compliance and Privacy Officer for PSEG. PSEG is a large energy company here in the Northeast. If you are from this area, you probably know who PSEG is. We provide about 40% of the electricity that comes into New York City. We're based out of New Jersey, about $10 billion market cap company, primarily located in the Northeast, about 13,000 employees. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Ritu Jain. I'm the Chief Compliance Officer covering the Asia region for General Electric. GE, as you know, is a conglomerate with multiple business lines. We are in 170 plus countries, 300,000 employees, and we are undergoing a lot of change, as you are seeing in the news. So interesting times for us here.
Very good. Thanks to you all. So again, I had mentioned at the outset that really pragmatism is going to be an overarching theme of today's conversation. And with that, I figure we'll start with just a little bit of level setting on, with regards to harassment, reporting, and investigations. What's the framework you all employ at your respective organizations? And I'll perhaps go in reverse order this time. So Ritu, if you want to start us off.
Sure. So I think just like any other integrity concerns, harassment is a big one for GE, and an area that we have spent a lot of time in the recent times, not just based on the external environment, but also internally. As the company's demographics are changing, our workforce composition is changing. This is something that we have spent a lot of time on awareness as well as resolution. So we treat harassment concerns similar to any integrity concern that's reported. So with the same level of seriousness right from the time of prevention, which is creating awareness, encouraging reporting, tracking each and every concern that's reported, having a dedicated team of specialized investigators to investigate such concerns, and then I think the big one is resolution and how we respond when we see these cases, and what do we do after, in terms of sharing those real examples, being transparent and being culturally sensitive when we talk about these issues. So there's a whole machinery in place in how we handle harassment concerns. And of course, as we go down the discussion today, we'd love to share more about it.
So full disclosure, Ritu and I both used to work, or she still does. I used to work at the GE program, and I'm the first Chief Compliance Officer for PSEG. So no surprise, our program is exactly the same as what Ritu described. If it works and if it's not broken, don't fix it. So over the last 3 years, I've been working to implement what I would regard as the GE model, which I consider the gold standard in how to manage concern raising and a concern management program. I'll just make one brief note as it relates to resolution that Ritu talked about. One of the things that we really are very focused on is ensuring that everybody that we touch in the course of looking into a concern, that we provide them feedback. So whether you are the concern raiser, whether you're the subject of the allegation, if you're aware of the investigation, or whether you're a witness in the investigation, you will receive a closure at the end of the process. And the reason why we do that is because when I joined, I was fortunate enough to have the benefit of the results of an employee survey that was handed to me. It was the first thing that I got as a new CCO. And in the employee survey, we could tell that there was a perception, at the very least, that nothing was being done when concerns were being raised. And when I looked at what the company was doing, I couldn't really substantiate that nothing was being done. But there was a reason for that. And as we dug in, I realized that it was because nobody was really providing meaningful feedback to all parties at the end of an investigation. And people were filling that gap of information with a bad assumption, meaning that either nothing had been done, or people didn't care, or there were no consequences. So we've noticed a trend in the positive once that we've really made sure that feedback is being provided, that now everybody knows that at the end of the process what was done and why. We've noticed a significant change in how people perceive the program. And as a result, I believe, at least partially to that, we're seeing more people come forward and trust the system and raise more concerns.
Great. So I'll just share that there's two themes that we're focused on in the process. Well, three themes. One is standard work, standard process. One is transparency, and one is communications. So I'm a long tenured 3M'er, 25 years, only 2 years in compliance. I'm a chemist and an engineer, and I've been running businesses for the 10 years prior to this. So I've been a user of the process as opposed to an administrator of the process. So, everything that we'll talk about is, well, why don't we go talk to some sales reps in Indonesia where I lived for 3 years? And if they understand the process, then we're good, right? As opposed to what we like to think is kind of the way it should be. So we've done a lot, I think, in terms of transparency of process to our employees, and also collaboration across functions, because the most confusing thing to an employee is when someone says, well, we're not looking at that. That's audit, or that's HR. The employee experience is, I raised a concern. You told me to speak up, and it, and now all of a sudden I don't know what's going on or where it's going. So we've done a lot of work to consolidate, streamline the employee experience throughout that process, the investigation.
Yeah, and I should mention as well, please feel free to interject with questions throughout. We are willing to take them as you guys think of them. So we'll, of course, pause the end for questions, but as you have them, please raise your hand. We'll be happy to take them as well. And one thing to touch on, too, so all three of you, either Rita, you had mentioned sharing, Antonio and Vina, you had mentioned transparency pretty significantly. One thing that we measured at Ethisphere as part of our processes is, to what extent are folks turning around and sharing the reporting data? Are they circulating? And to what extent? Mm-hmm. To give you a sample, the most recent years of data for WME suggested about roughly half the organizations we recognized either do so publicly or do so internally to all employees in some way, shape, or form. I'm curious to see if you all could touch on ways in which you're sharing within your own organizations and sort of the experience behind that.
Yeah, sure. So I think the sharing has increased significantly. Mm-hmm. And the difference we see is there was a time where we would tell people, hey, report concerns. If you're seeing violations, report concerns. And that was good in the beginning. And then we realized that unless you tell people what to report, they don't know what to report. So you have to be very intentional into, one, what's our view of risk? And am I giving those examples to employees to actually raise their hand and say, oh, yeah, you talked about this, now I'm seeing this. So just to give you an example, last year we ran a company-wide campaign on sexual harassment, and with the underlying themes of diversity, inclusion. And we actually used examples, and we made our leaders enact those examples in front of the employees. It was not easy. When we said, hey, you all need to get up and actually enact this real case that happened in front of the employees, especially on sexual harassment, which are so subtle situations. Our leaders were initially uncomfortable, but they did. And we saw an uptick, like a direct correlation of after we did that campaign and the uptick in numbers. Mm-hmm. And then you know that if you want to measure something and you need data on something, you need to be intentional about communicating to employees that this is the kind of issues that you need to bring up, and you see that uptick. So, and the other factor is, I mentioned before, is change in demographics. more and more, we are getting into we were a company where we had employees, 20-year, 30-year engineers, scientists, technologists, and now, we have employees who are right out of college, and they are joining digital and IT and services workspace. And you clearly see the way they see issues and how open they are about talking about those issues. You see the impact of movements like Me Too and social media, and clearly that's a good reflection of how changing workforce shows up in your reporting trends. So clearly, I think we're seeing an uptick, and that gives us enough information to slice and dice in terms of are people reporting anonymously, how many confirmations we are seeing, how long did it take to resolve a concern. So data is definitely helping us.
For us, I think it's been about right-sizing the information and the audience for the information. So when I joined, in my view, we were sharing a lot of information about the Concerns program with the management team, but like I said earlier, not a lot of information going out about the resolution of the concerns with the stakeholders of the program. So throughout the last 3 years, what we've been trying to do is, in some ways, limit the amount of information that goes to management when concerns are raised and they're the subject of investigation, and be a little bit more broad in the dissemination of information at the conclusion of the investigation. And the reason for that, and harassment is no different than other areas, is that most of the cases are not substantiated. And a lot of times, if you're sharing information about a concern that's been raised, either regarding the subject of the allegation or the concern raiser, we're human beings. We're gonna create opinions and think about people maybe differently, or have a question in our mind about this person or that person. And ultimately, there's no substantiation about the issue involved. And in harassment cases, it could be particularly, sticky and difficult to undo that perception about a person, even when you don't substantiate the concern. So we've been very focused on, and it is, I think for most of the programs, if not all of them, part of your brand has to be the confidentiality of the process. So if you don't really right-size the type of information and the person who receives it, that really has a need to know for that information at the time that you're providing it, you run the risk of, sort of confirming people's perceptions or bad perceptions about programs, which is, this is just a means for management to get at information. So in order to address that, we've been really spending a lot of time on really being thoughtful about who receives what and when. That's been a very nuanced conversation, because you can imagine if as a leader in a business, you have for the last 10 years received a notification every time a concern is raised in your business, and now the new chief compliance officer tells you that you're no longer going to receive that. That doesn't go over very well sometimes. So it's about getting people comfortable with that, but they may perceive as a gap of information, and to trust that the compliance program and the concerns management program, once it's appropriate, they will share information with them, and that we will be looking at trends, and that when we see hot spots, we will flag those for them. So there's a little bit of trust building going on too there, as well as information management.
I think for transparency, so we do publish quarterly case studies to all of our employees and metrics. So we never used to do this, so this is actually a very good step for us, where here's how many allegations, here's the substantiation rate, here's the discipline that happened by type, because we want people to know that, number one, not everybody gets fired for everything, right? There could be multiple places on the continuum that you could have a coaching conversation, you could have a warning, you could get terminated. And I think then we use multiple modes, and our team's been focused on two areas. One is executives. We have very great people at 3M, but we're a Midwest company, we're a 117-year-old company, and people get this sense of, well, that doesn't happen here. And I'm very much a confronting reality, like, here are the things that are said in this company, by the way, in this campus in the last 6 months. And so just those statements, and people are kind of shocked, like, this happens here? Yes, it happens here, and so here's what we can do about it, right? So that's one. And we go to like the executive operating committees of all the businesses to have a very candid conversation about trends. And we go broader than harassment. We look at all respectful workplace or workplace civility trends, and we show also the trends where the leadership in the company are the people of interest. So are we seeing that increase or decrease, and why could that be? What does that look like? How does it show up? And then on the other extreme, you know, our salespeople globally. I'm very passionate about our salespeople, and so we've got 11,000 people around the world. And having face-to-face conversations with them, our team goes to national sales meetings, sales branches. I just spoke in Palm Springs to 450 of our industrial sales reps, and we talk about how things show up in the respectful workplace, and we tell stories. I was happy to share with them things that happened to me 18 years ago as an abrasive sales rep in Canada, right? And how did that show up, and how would that be acceptable or not acceptable today? How are things changing over time in terms of acceptable behavior?
Yeah, the storytelling point too is so profound. It's something that we see time and time again, the impact that tying in real life stories, you know, without calling out individuals, of course, has such a profound impact when doing so. Both the good and the bad, by the way. I think it was maybe Antonio, you who made the point that you don't always want to highlight those who have been fired, but you know, tell the good stories as well. So it's, you know, it's a value-add experience. You had mentioned that the sharing of case studies and metrics is new at 3M. For those organizations who are perhaps exploring something similar, any advice or guidance you can provide to get leadership buy-in? I know in many instances that the concept of sharing those figures can be daunting, to say the least. Any lessons learned for anyone on the panel? But Vita, I know it's new for you, so I figured I'd pick on you. Sorry.
So for me, my question was why not?
Yeah.
And you know, I think within our group in legal affairs, we had to get comfortable. I think the business has been asking for a long time, give us more data. Like you say this shows up, but tell us more. And I think that we were able to get comfortable with a certain level of transparency. And there's been no negative consequence to date for doing this. And so I think that was part of the maybe reservation up front.
And I think if you're thinking about doing this, what you should think about is if in sharing the information, are you revealing anything about a person? And short of doing that, then you should be very open, because I think what these programs work if people believe that the programs work, if they actually trust them. And there's very few ways that you can demonstrate that to somebody short of here's the case, here's what we did. So you are not going to be able to do that with thousands of people. So sharing the data is probably the best way to do that. And it will pay a lot of benefits. And the other thing that you're seeing too, the institutional investors are asking for this kind of information and are asking, is your board looking at this? Are they aware of it? So it's not just for the benefit of the compliance program. There's multiple dividends that sharing the information will pay, not the least of which, and further enhancing the perception among the employees that I can trust the program because look at all these things. People are coming forward, things are happening as a result of the concerns.
Yeah, so I would take off on that point on sharing the data. So I think we all agree that we share the trends and metrics with the leadership team, also with the employees, and I think it's important for them to see. In India, we have a specific law on prevention of sexual harassment, and now there is a requirement on all public companies in India to actually specifically report how many sexual harassment concerns they have received and how they have resolved and disposed them. And there is a reporting to the board in addition to the regular whistleblower reporting, fraud reporting. We have to report sexual harassment cases and how we've dealt with them. I think that's one part, but while data is very powerful, I don't think that's enough. Just sharing numbers will not do anybody any good. So our employees want to know what really happened. And I remember there was one training and they said, oh, but all of these bad things happen in US. All these big scandals happen in US. And then we realized there is really no use sharing international examples. Yes, they are important, but unless you tell them, hey, by the way, in this business, at this site, something like this happened, and you have to make sure that enough cooling period has pass before you're sharing that information to avoid conjecture. But unless you do that, people think like, oh, it probably only happens in US or somewhere else. So you have to make it real for people where you are addressing the audience. And I think a big part of building trust is really giving the channels for people to report, making sure you have an efficient channel, efficient mechanism to resolve those concerns, because reporting is only 10%. Actual resolution and taking action is a big chunk of it. And then closing the loop with your employees and saying, we got it, we resolved it, because otherwise, unless somebody is fired, people may think, oh, nothing really happened. And sometimes you're like, oh, but that guy's still in the company. What they don't know is probably there has been a check on their salary or their compensation, or they've got a written warning. So I think you have to communicate what actions you have taken, and only when you do all these three things, you build a completely comprehensive reporting mechanism, I think.
Be specific about how much detail you share about what happened to the employee?
So we don't share specific details. We convert these real cases into case studies, and then we will make it detailed enough to ensure that somebody cannot be recognized. So that we will say there was a senior leader or somebody else who did something. This is how it was reported. This is how it was handled. Here's what we found, and this is the action we took. Now, we will be careful that it's not, the information we are sharing is not specific to recognize who that person was, but it's detailed enough so that employees know the full picture versus saying, oh, we fired 5 people for sexual harassment.
But I thought, was it maybe you, Antonio, who mentioned that at the end of an investigation, you go back and do a detail of anybody who's involved? What level of feedback do you give?
It depends of the role of the person in the investigation. So witnesses probably get the least amount of information. So they are thanked. Thank you. That's just doing that. You'd be surprised how much people appreciated that, the fact that they were thanked. Because for most people, when they interact with the investigations program, it can be a very unsettling experience. Then in addition to thanking them, we notify them that whether there's anything else we need from them. So in the investigations, a lot of the witnesses want to know, is it over? So we provide them that. And depending on their relationship to the concern that was raised, some people are tangentially involved, so those people don't get anything beyond that. Other people, if they were, part of the group of people that witnessed the event or something like that, they will then get something about the corrective action. So any corrective actions that are personnel related are just, the way we address them is we say additional actions that we can't discuss for confidentiality and personnel reasons we can't tell you, but corrective actions are being taken. And then any corrective actions that are not personnel related, so any training, new procedures, anything that's more systemic, that's disclosed to them. The subject of the allegation receives more fuller closeout. That person will know whether the concern was substantiated or not, and clearly if there's some corrective action, they will know. And the concern raiser gets about the same as the subject of the allegation. They are told whether it was substantiated or not, and they're also told, particularly when concerns are not substantiated, the basis for the non-substantiation. So in some cases, we review some of the specific items that we uncovered during the investigation, which there's particularly for the thornier cases, so we work with counsel to have talking points for the investigator to have a very crisp conversation. And then after the conversation happens, in our concern tracking tool, the investigator documents what they said and any feedback they received from the concern raiser or the subject. And again, that's what GE does, so that's what we do. And then on the what Ritu was saying, we do tell people when we publish, so we publish similar to what both of you talked about. Every month, we try to have a theme. So let's say we're talking about improper payments. So we're gonna talk about improper payments, and we talk about our practice in one communication. We talk about training related to improper payments. And then we also have another communication about cases around improper payments. So that for that month, you have several different pieces of communication that touch on the same subject matter, but from different points of view. And as it relates to the cases, we talk about what was alleged, what did we uncover in the investigation, and what the corrective actions were. And we anonymize as best we can so that there's no disparagement risk for the company. We're very fortunate that the general counsel for the company who I report to has told me from the very beginning she would much rather take the risk of having to fight a disparagement claim than to have people not learn from our mistakes, which is not that's not always the case. But we've been very fortunate so far, and employees really like it. We just published a case study where we disclosed about how a manager had discriminated against an employee on the basis of their age and their marital status. And we talked about how the manager was separated from the company. And we received the most hits of any post ever published in the company's history, and the most comments and people thanking the compliance team for. So, I hardly ever get thank yous. So it was, it's sort of what further confirmation that we're doing the right thing as far as the employees are concerned. So that's a very good question. So what I'll say is, so far, if there is an investigation that's very sensitive, that has significant legal exposure to the company or regulatory exposure, a lot of times those investigations are done under privilege. And if we're conducting a privileged investigation, the circle of people that have a need to know for the outcome of the investigation is much more narrow than for an ordinary investigation like what I just talked about. So if we're talking about, we don't tend to privilege all of our investigations. So most of our investigations, by the time they're concluded, we remove the privilege. And they're confidential, but not privileged. But for investigations that are more significant, where there could be actual, let's say, liability for the corporation rather than an individual, those investigations are treated differently. There is an assessment that we do at the end of the case as to whether, but generally our bias has been, as of recent times, to disclose and to share with the employees what the outcome was. And it's a measured risk, but we think it's a risk worth taking.
But I think confidentiality is a good point, especially for cases like harassment, even during the investigation process. And there was a case in India, it was a public news for another large company, where there was a guy who was alleged of sexual harassment. He committed suicide because he was being investigated, but his colleagues got to know that he was being investigated. And even before the investigation could be concluded, he couldn't bear the social stigma, and he was a senior person in that company. He couldn't bear the fact that he was even under the scanner, and the fact that his colleagues got to know. So I think that was a big learning moment for all of us, that how important it is to maintain confidentiality. Of course, it's important to maintain confidentiality in all investigations, but so much more in these kind of cases. So that also brings back to the point on how do you investigate these concerns. And you can't have somebody who is investigating anti-corruption or a conflict concern have the same skill sets to investigate a harassment concern. How do you ask those questions to witnesses without revealing the identity of the person? Because more often than not, there were two people in the room, and it could be he said and she said, and who else was observing. And beyond the subject and the concern raiser, when you are trying to gather a fact pattern, an investigator has to be very careful as to what their line of questioning is, what are their biases that they keep aside, I mean, simply because there was a young girl who was crying doesn't mean she's saying the truth, you know. So there is just so much more in terms of the skill set for that investigator. And of course, that plays into confidentiality during the process.
So off that, so who do you have to train investigators? Do you typically use HR employees, in-house attorneys, and then also kind of training people?
So we have now a specialized team of HR investigators who do get specific training, and they come typically from an HR or compliance background, so they know, they're very well versed with the process, and they work in tandem with our Labor and Employment Council. We also have a process in India as per the local regulation where we have to form committees. Now that's interesting because those committees are formed by regular full-time employees who have been given powers of a civil court to investigate POSH concerns, but we ensure that they are guided by an external counsel who is an expert in this field, so that they are not, maybe they get 2 cases in a year to investigate, so they don't have that expertise, but it's a requirement of the law. So we make sure that they work under the guidance of an external counsel in those cases.
So we had investigators all over the company, and we recently brought the employee relations investigators into our compliance team, but they have an HR background.
Yeah.
And the reason we did that was because there was a lot of variability in process, reporting, tracking of data, and that created, I think, additional risk for us as a company. And so by doing this, we've got the right people for the role, but they're following a very standard process and tracking so that we can do things, the way we'd like.
A question regarding the competition for complainants. So, if complainants have to substantiate the case, do you tell the complainant anything about the nature of this interaction with the subject?
Not usually. So the question was, when you're closing out with a concern raiser, in cases where you did substantiate the concern, do you tell them about any disciplinary action that results from the substantiation? So generally, we do not discuss the specific disciplinary actions, and what we say is, it's a very human interest to know what's going to happen to this person now that you told me that they did this bad thing. So the way we ordinarily explain is, you probably would not want us telling somebody else about, what we would do if we're disciplining you or taking some. So just the same that we would treat you, we treat every other employee. So we can't discuss the specifics. And most people understand that. I think that argument is fairly compelling to most people. Now, some people are very emotional about their concern, and it doesn't matter what you tell them. They're not going to have a rational response. But for the most part, we've had good success in leaving it at that, and the employee is usually satisfied.
So my second question is, you mentioned that you will sometimes, when it's not being substantiated, go to the complainants and explain why.
Yes.
So that seems like a response.
Yeah. So our substantiation rate is about, it fluctuates between 30 and 40%. So that means that 7 or 6 people out of 10, you're telling them, we didn't find any, or we didn't substantiate your concern. And for most people, that feels like a very personal thing, like you're telling me I'm lying or you don't believe me. So in order to build trust in the program, we decided that we needed to go a little bit further and just share, and at a high level, but based on, we did this many interviews, we reviewed these many documents, and we give them generally. We couldn't find enough evidence to support what you were saying. If you have anything that you think you would help us, then please provide it to us. So we usually leave it at that. If you have additional information that you think we didn't consider, then please let us know so we can consider it. And usually the best way to address that, though, is at the intake stage of the concern. So what I've asked the people who do the intake is I ask them to share the substantiation rates at the beginning so that we can manage expectations. And we tell them, more than likely at the end of this process, this is the conversation that we'll be having. And it doesn't mean that we don't believe you. It doesn't mean that we think you're lying. It just means that we couldn't find enough evidence to prove your point. And that actually has been very helpful. And we've gotten a lot of feedback from our concern raisers that they thought that the intake was a very good step in the process.
I think sometimes if the specific allegation's not substantiated, you find other things that you can do from a, it could be, that a specific behavior didn't happen, but you sense enough from the interviews that we better go in there and do some assessment of the culture of right? And so you can kind of have that as opposed to, this person did this specific thing. So we do that as well.
Lena and Antonio, do you both use an ombuds program, or do you go to an external provider like Ombuds?
So we don't have a formal ombuds I guess it depends on the definition. So you'll talk about the GE, maybe or formerly GE definition, but we use Navex from a call center and case management, and then we have a network called the Local Compliance Contact Network. Not a very jazzy name, but we're changing that. But so we have 120 people around the world that are on the ground in different, and they are kind of keep the pulse, and they also will report things up, but they don't do investigations or anything like that. But that's kind of our pulse checking. But other than that, we don't have a formal program.
We use Navex to manage our external helpline, and they do intakes through the helpline. But for the most part, most of our intakes with the concern raiser, once we identify it as a concern, so if it's referred from management, is done by our dedicated team of investigators. So we have full-time employees that serve as an investigator. So the investigators are also the people who are responsible for concern management. But it's about 13,000 employees, almost everybody in the same time zone. So far, we haven't gotten to a point where we've decided that there's a need to have an ombuds network, even though, as you know very well, that I appreciate the ombuds and I think there's a lot of value in the ombuds program. I think if we went to a next phase, it would likely be more like a compliance ambassador, more than an ombuds to receive concerns and manage concerns. I think where we are in our journey right now, that's probably the more pressing need.
Could you elaborate why
Well, I think for us, it's this whole challenge of operationalizing the program and embedding it within the lines of business. I think we would be a lot more successful in identifying people that can penetrate deeper into the business. So I think that'll be the first task before we even get to an ombuds program.
One crosswalk between communications and transparency and data that we haven't talked about is the possibility of getting data and information from those involved in the process to get their opinions. So whether it be through survey instruments or otherwise after the fact, to learn the impact that your investigation process is having on the work environment of the director. So I know a couple of companies that do it and have done it successfully. I'm curious if any of you have either thought about it or actually implemented something where you're learning directly from those involved in the process how to do things better and what kinds of things you might have
I hear unsolicited feedback sometimes. We have not formalized that, but that is something that we think would be a great addition because you can learn a lot from that.
So we haven't formalized that either, and similar to what Veena said, we get the feedback from the concern. That I think the reason we haven't formalized it, one, because an investigator, so if you look at GE, we get probably 2,000, 3,000 concerns a year across the company, and there are so many different touch points during an investigation process. Not all of them are captured in a system to send like a specific response. Even when they are captured, the confidentiality is so important that only very few people can see who has raised a concern and who was a subject. So sometimes people don't want to be contacted. They're like, look, I'm trusting you and I'm telling you my identity, but like, I don't want anybody to know. And that's why I think the way we look at whether how strong our process is through surveys, where we do talk about, okay, have you raised a concern? Would you raise a concern? Would you fear retaliation? So I think we look that measure versus trying to directly identify who participated in an investigation process and get, as good as that sounds, we just worry about all these other different angles and the fact that we don't want to capture each and every person who participated in the concern process in a system.
So for us, we've been thinking about it. And the first step in that process was to identify what was the expectation. So we published last year an investigator's code of conduct to sort of tell the people who participate in the process sort of like a patient's bill of rights at a hospital or a doctor's office. So what are the things that they should expect from the investigators when they interact with them? So now that that's been well socialized, one of the things that we're considering doing this year is having something called Net Promoter Score, an NPS score, for the investigators. So that's something that we're thinking about doing this year. There's other companies, Lockheed, for example, I know does this. We're looking into it. More than likely we will end up doing it. I think the problem is, and this is the challenge, I think, is with the data. So if, let's say you start just measuring your concern raisers, you already know 6 out of 10 are not going to get a no substantiation conversation. So are they going to be inherently biased to have a negative score as a result? So those are some of the things that we're thinking about as we're thinking about implementing.
I think one of the things you can certainly find, not that you're going to find that everybody's happy with the process per se, but whether somebody was treated with respect in the process. And that's a real driver of overall satisfaction.
Yes.
Can I ask a question about root cause analysis? You have one that are substantiated. Can you talk about what you do there?
So we just actually 2 quarters ago started implementing post an investigation once it's closed, having the investigator work with the team on what do we believe is the root cause. And we went back through 2 years of data and kind of went through what would that look like and saw, are there themes, could we do that, what would those buckets look like? So we started implementing that now to see what's the frequency and where are we breaking down? What's breaking down, right? Is it a process, is it a control, or is there some behavior, is there a behavioral aspect that we're just missing? So our data's, we're doing that for the last 2 quarters actively, but we went back 2 years to kind of look at what do those categories look like, and then benchmarking.
In our concern tracking tool, root cause is a must field. So an investigator, when they investigate a concern, they not only have to say confirmed or not confirmed, but why it happened. Was it somebody knowingly doing it? I think specifically for harassment concerns, was it somebody abusing their power? Was the culture of the place like that? Was it an unintentional or a mistake? Was it a tone issue? And that's important because the reason defines the corrective action. Is that person so new that they require training, or is that person so senior and they should have known that it requires a much stricter discipline? So I think we directly tie root cause, and then that's on a case-by-case basis, but then later you do analysis of the data and you say, okay, if I'm seeing 20 harassment concerns, are they largely being driven from a training gap because people didn't know, or we are just promoting bad behavior amongst leaders? So that data helps you figure out what sustainable actions you need to take based on why these concerns are coming up.
So we do the same. We added, root cause, sub-root cause. It's tied to the corrective actions at the end of the year. We can run a report and say, here's the primary causes for our substantiated sexual harassment concerns. Usually it's intentional wrongdoing for those kinds of cases. But for other cases where it's not just a bad actor, it's very helpful to have that data because then you know where you have training opportunities, process changes, new procedures, changing management. And the tool that we use is very customizable. So we've been able to, pivot and add new things, subtract others, as we learn more about the things that we need to populate on the tool. But so far, it's been very helpful.
One thing we haven't talked about, but I think is relevant to the conversations of this morning, are back to culture. I think, if you think about a lot of investigations we've had recently, whether it's, the legal definition of harassment in the United States or just respectful workplace in general, it's really about the culture you have, right? So we will have people say, well, what do you mean? I mean, I got to where I am because of who I am, and this is how I operate. And I think we've had to spend a lot of time talking about what's the culture of 3M and how it, so one of our value elements for our culture is around powered by inclusion. So the basis for inclusion is respect, and I think somebody brought that up this morning. So if you don't even feel respected as a person, you have no chance of me feeling included in anything you're doing, right? So, but we have to go back and refresh everybody that, number one, there's a book, right? They say what got you here won't get you there. I think our whole culture is evolving to say, whatever you think the rules are of the past, whether they're unwritten, that doesn't play. Here's the culture of 3M, and here's what we value, and here's how you have to show up. And if you don't, there are consequences. And I think that's a harsh realization for many people who may have long tenure, who may have felt that they got where they got because of they call it an edge, or whatever it is they call it, right? This is the throwing of things, or the kind of very intimidating behavior. Well, we just don't do that here.
And it's very apparent in the harassment concerns, both from an investigator standpoint as well as where you are investigating. So we've had cases where some people would have said, oh, we didn't really care about it. Men, that's how they are. Or some people don't even recognize that could be a harassment action. And sometimes we have people who may get biased by where their background is. So they may say, oh, but that guy and that female, they are married and they're having an extramarital affair. And then we have to cross the line between saying, we are not moral policing. We have to define between what is harassment versus what, in your mind, may be immoral behavior. And I think it's interesting to see how so many of these things play out when you talk to the concerned raiser, the witness, the subject, how they thought about their behavior, because they were never challenged. And they just thought that this is the way to behave, and then you have to tell them that, no, this is not the way to behave. So I think the culture piece, and it also varies by region, by the geography you are investigating. So I think that's I totally agree with you, Veena. It's the biggest point when you look at the harassment cycle.
Can we talk about retaliation for a moment? What happens after the investigation? What do you do in a closed-out conversation and beyond? Not only level set what is retaliation and maybe what isn't, but also to check back in or counsel everyone who's been involved in everyone's been involved in the investigation, even beyond maybe the managers who beyond with it, to make sure that there is no intentional or unintentional retaliation.
So we could probably have another panel just on that subject,
Yeah,
right?
I know.
So I'll be very brief. So when we close out with, and let's say even when we don't substantiate, we do have this conversation, which is, if you feel you're treated any differently because you participate in this process, you have to call me right away. We tell that everybody. A witness, a concerned raiser, or a subject. We tell them the same. Usually with the subject or with a manager, the conversation goes the extra step of, you can't treat anybody any differently for having engaged in this process. I mean, if you do so, you will likely be terminated. And when we tell them that when it comes to retaliation in particular, that's a bright line rule for the company. So if we find that you retaliate against another employee, you can't work here. So we make that very clear. And then, so we also have revised our actual language in our code of conduct to be more broader about how we define retaliation for ourselves, for the company. So we're primarily based in New Jersey. New Jersey has an anti-retaliation statute. Our bar is higher than the legal bar. And oftentimes you will get into these arguments about, is it retaliation, is it not? So it's, our thought process was, we don't want to set our bar to coincide with the legal bar, because then when you breach the code of conduct, now you've broken the law. We don't want to be in that position. And we want to have higher expectations of each other. So that's how we think about retaliation, and that's the way the conversation goes. And then as far as ongoing monitoring, that's where, we partner a lot with the HR team. So when we close out a case that's substantiated, the client director for that line of business is aware. And their role is to monitor appraisals, salary actions, to make sure that there's no sort of subtle or overt retaliation. People nominated for training and that kind of other opportunities.
Yeah, we have, for known reporters, our investigators will go back 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and then 8 weeks after the matter's closed, because typically you'll see if something is going to happen, even subtly, all of a sudden someone's not high potential, all of a sudden, they don't get to manage people. It tends to happen within a very short time span. So we try to keep track. And for anonymous, we communicate through our, through Navex, right, through the portal, to kind of ask people to keep us engaged in what's happening. But we do a lot of outreach, especially with supervisors and leaders, about just what Antonio said. Here's how this shows up. If you get interviewed and then you go ask everybody who reports to you, what did you say? What did they ask you? You can be pretty clear that you probably won't be here very long. That would be worse than actually whatever the thing is that you did, right, or didn't do. So we're very clear about that. Yeah.
So just to let you all know, we have time for one more question before our time's up. So.
So how do you balance sort of the need to tell employees what procedures will be, what policies will be, how you train your investigators, but on the flip side, you need to be nimble and to be able to change what you do depending on what you find, right? Because oftentimes you're investigating one thing and then it becomes an octopus with a bunch of different tentacles, and you need to be nimble enough to move around, but you create an expectation by having different policies, very transparent, but you don't always. It's not always advisable to follow those policies, and then you create this false expectations. How do you manage that?
So I don't think the policies need to change because of the experience that we are having, at a very fast pace. So yeah, we revisit our policies in terms of, okay, the times have changed or we are seeing new trends, and therefore we may need to update our policy. But I don't think it changes the baseline expectations that we, and the standards we set for our employees to report a concern, to see an issue. What we do though is keep our awareness and training materials real time. I think that's how many people really pick up a policy and read it, right? Like hardly. What they remember and register.
Yes, that's right.
Exactly. So, most of them, we have the policies, we promote them, but really that's just the basic minimum. I think what's more important is how you are making those policies real and translating them for the employees to understand in the simplest fashion. And the simplest way they understand is if you give them examples, in my view. Unless you tell them, hey, look, this is what could go wrong and this is what could happen and this is how you should raise your hand. I think that's the basic that they need to know. They may not even know what clause 5 of harassment section says in that policy. So that's my view, that I think keeping your communications real time, customizing it to the audience, the way you converse with a field engineer who's sitting at a customer site is very different from the way you're talking to somebody who's sitting in headquarters. I think that's where we need to focus more on versus thinking about, okay, do we need to push our policies down or change the way we operate here?
So our policies do have a carve-out where either me or the general counsel are afforded the discretion of managing individual cases in our discretion. So the policy is the general policy, but it always has the precisely for what you, and there are some cases that might be more thorny and present more reputational risk for the company, so that our standard way of going back to everybody may not apply, to the point that you asked earlier. And then the policy affords me or the general counsel the discretion to apply a different process. And that's how we would deal with our litigation friends.
I do some investigations, and then I talk interface with the government.
Yeah.
And the government does not love to hear
No. And if and when we exercise that discretion, we create a contemporaneous document that says, I'm making this decision and this is why.
All right. Well, on that note, I want to thank the panel, Vina, Antonio, Ritu. Thank you for giving me
Thank
the easiest job at the conference. I would say this was quite easy. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.